Welcome to this illustrated talk on the spread of rugby football in the public schools in the period 1840 to 1880. The narrative can be paused, moved back, or moved forward as you wish. In an earlier talk, I described how football took hold in the 7 boarding public schools in the second quarter of the 19th century. And, as new public schools were founded in later years, so each school took on the game. But each school had its own code. This produced a problem when public school old boys went up to the universities. Which code should they play? In a second talk, I traced the attempts at Cambridge from the 1840s to create a common code for all 7 major boarding schools. With hindsight, we know that they were doomed to fail. I show this table again to remind you why. The red text highlights where the rugby code was out of step with that played at Shrewsbury and Eton, and with that played at Charterhouse, Harrow, Westminster and Winchester. The Rugby support for running with the ball in hand, hacking at an opponent's shins and tripping him up when on the run, all these led to the rugby representatives in 1863 withdrawing from the talks to produce a common football code. 8 years later, in 1871, they set up their own Rugby Football Union. If, with hindsight, it is obvious that the rugby code could never be incorporated within a common code of the other 6 schools, why, you might ask, did rugbyans persist for so long with the common code deliberations? For nearly 20 years. Does one of these 4 possible reasons hold the key? We have noted earlier that most Old Salopians at Cambridge were at St John's College, and that many Old Etonians were next door at Trinity. But where were the Old Rugbyans? As you can see, Oxford is much closer to Rugby. Close enough for a mid-Victorian to walk there and back in a day. Frederick Temple, undergraduate and future headmaster of Rugby, walked there in the late 1830s to meet Thomas Arnold, and he is quite prepared to walk back the same evening. The poet Arthur Clough, one of Arnold's star pupils, made the same 2-way journey for the same purpose in 1841. Here are the figures for Arnold's first years as headmaster of Rugby. 40% of leavers go to university, with Oxford the preferred choice. It was a well-worn path. First, Arnold was an Oxford man. So too, for the past 47 years, nearly half a century, was every assistant master, excluding a couple of foreigners teaching French and German. It was thus a massive break in tradition when, in his second year as headmaster, Arnold appointed James Prince Lee to teach the 5th form, the second highest form in the school. Lee was a distinguished classical scholar, a Cambridge man, and from Trinity College, studying among all those old Etonians. His arrival at Rugby signalled a swing of the university pendulum. But first, note Arnold's quick success. Entrance to the school up from 66 to 113 in 2 years. University entrance up from 26 to 47 in the same period. Now the college in Cambridge with the most ORs is Lee's own college, Trinity. Just as Butler and Kennedy had sent the ablest old Salopians to St. John's, now Lee was steering his ablest pupils to Trinity. Of course, he did not intend to start a football revolution, but that is what he did. Arnold was certainly physically active as a young man at Oxford, and when he opened a private school in the Thames Valley with his brother. There he took part in gymnastic exercises, swimming, sailing, and rowing with his pupils, but there is no mention of team games. There is no evidence that either Arnold or Lee took any interest in the boys' football or cricket at Rugby. Oxford continued to be the preferred university for Rugbyans in the 1840s, but the swing to Cambridge is significant, particularly as more than half of them were going to just one college, Lee's Trinity. The number of ORs at Trinity now matched the number of old Salopians next door at St. John's. Both had enough to maintain their own code of football. The success of Arnold at Rugby and Kennedy at Shrewsbury enhanced the reputation of the public schools in the 1840s. The new middle classes, aspiring to become gentlemen, wanted to enroll their sons alongside the aristocrats and gentry at the 7 boarding public schools. But there was not enough room, so many new schools were founded, including Cheltenham, Marlborough, Rossall, Radley, Lancing and Hurstpierpoint. 9 headmasters of these new schools had strong links with Rugby, as pupils or masters, and 5 had been together at Trinity. Were these men in these schools the means to spread the handling code of football? The plan B if nothing came of the common code. Please note the AM and HM shorthands for future slides. Herbert Hill is our first rugby code diffuser. He restored the playing field, his predecessor had used it as his kitchen garden, and introduced organised games. Hill was a keen supporter of football, described by an old boy as a moderately rough game, occasionally resulting in heavy falls which necessitated some slight hurts. OR means Old Rugbyan. A contemporary recorded, Dr. Collis was fond of catching the ball on the bounce, but he never ran. He stood stock still with the ball in his arms, and the consequence was a crowd of players flocked round him like a hive of bees, and in due course the pressure began to be rather serious, with various cries proceeding from the centre of the scrimmage, till at last the doctor dropped the ball and thus got out of the scrum, only to begin again if he had the chance. Vaughan was no sportsman, but he saw games, and football in particular, having disciplinary value. He delegated authority to the senior boys, the Philathletic Club, and they ensured that games were compulsory. Masters and Old Rugbyians were not the only early football spreaders. The Acton brothers exchanged Rugby for the newly founded Cheltenham College, presumably because it was nearer to their home in Ireland. They took the Rugby code with them. 52 years later, and Cheltenham provided Rugby's first inter-school match opposition. Cheltenham won. Penrose, a rowing blue, was Arnold's nephew, a contemporary of Charles Vaughan and Thomas Hughes, and supposedly the model for Old Brook, Tom's house captain in Tom Brown's school days. He introduced rugby football to Sherborne in 1846. A contemporary recalled that the boys played football by the Rugby School rules, more or less. The influential Blackheath Football Club, playing the rugby code, was founded in 1858 by 3 old boys of the school. Advertisements stressed the school's dry location, bracing air and beautiful park, with archery, cricket and football that are superintended by the masters. Aged 25, Wright is likely to have been one of them. The proximity to rugby and Wright's association with 3 other old rugbyans at Trinity suggests that the football would have been played to the rugby code. The diffusion is underway. David Ray, who wrote on Rugby School in Puddings, Bullies and Squashes, knows of no school adopting rugby football before these 7. The 1850s witnessed the most rapid expansion of the public school system, with many new schools founded and still more raised from ancient grammar schools. New schools included Bradfield, Epsom and Wellington. Raised grammar schools included Repton, Tunbridge and Uppingham. The public school model was proving very successful. Nine schools adopted rugby football through diffusion. Crawford's son recalled seeing his father taking part in the hottest charges and wildest rushes, set upon by 3 or 4 of the biggest of his opponents, yet sending them spinning to right and left under old rugby rules. Durham brought the rugby version of football with him and blended it with the boys' own code to create a very particular flavour of football that continued to be played at the school until the adoption of Rugby Football Union rules in 1872. Although none of Felstead's first 22 boys was older than 12, a prefix system was introduced and provision was made for cricket and the rugby code of football. Leamington's links with Rugby School were strong. These included cricket matches, with a victory for Leamington in 1852, and it is likely that they both played the same code of football. Cotton imported rugby football and cricket. The active participation of young men newly appointed to the staff enabled his influence to be felt more effectively. The Acton brothers at Cheltenham were not the only boy diffusers. The Crombie brothers left Durham to be nearer their home in Scotland. Alexander enrolled at Edinburgh University and Francis joined the Edinburgh Academy. Both took rugby football with them. Lancing's early game resembled rugby football, but a try was called a ruff, and to convert it something like a scrum was formed. In 1871, a boy arriving from Westminster School persuaded the footballers to swap to soccer. Benson was instructed by Prince Albert to run Wellington, a memorial to the Iron Duke, on Prussian military lines, but after persuading the governors to put all control in his hands, he chose to lead a public school closely modelled upon rugby. Rouges and touchdown disappeared in school magazine reports at MGS by the 1890s and were replaced by goals. The school had now adopted association football. Parry, Bradley and Highton inherited rugby playing schools that we have already met, and all 3 reinforce the commitment to the game. There are now many more tentacles. Red shows the new 9, with 3 going north. Two government commissions examined the public schools, and their reports helped to boost their reputation. Yet more schools were founded, or were raised from ancient grammar schools. In 1866, a football match played to the Rugby Code was first recorded at King Edward's in Birmingham. Durham, who took the Rugby Code to Durham School in 1850, later became headmaster of Carlisle High School. Reports of football matches were published in local newspapers, 15-a-side games to the Rugby Code. When the East India College closed, the buildings were taken over by a school. Butler was appointed as Haileybury's founding headmaster. He drew up plans to show the first footballers how backs and half-backs should be placed. Percival was also appointed to lead a new school, Clifton. He quickly created a leading public school on the rugby model. The school's historian recorded, "Football has from the first proved one of the most valuable institutions owed to rugby." A match against Mr. Cook's school in November 1865 was won by 2 overs, a clear reference to the Rugby Code's means of scoring goals. The position of rugby football at 3 new proprietary schools, Cheltenham, Clifton and Haileybury, was boosted when the next round of headmaster appointments all went to men with strong rugby connections. Green arrows show the new rugby playing schools, in almost all points of the compass. These government reports were mentioned earlier. The commissioners were determined to discover if the vogue for sports was overshadowing scholarly pursuits. On the whole, they thought not. The cricket and football fields, the report of 1864 observed, are not merely places of exercise and amusement. They help to form some of the most valuable social qualities and manly virtues, and they hold, like the classroom and the boarding house, a distinct and important place in public school education. Potts brought the full complement of rugby school traditions to the new school. Rugby football began with the big side. It was indeed a big side. Everybody, over 50 boys, played in the one game, including 3 masters. Only 2 boys seemed to know the rules, but the rest picked them up quickly. By the end of the century, an old boy was able to claim that more internationals, blues and county players had learnt their rugger at Bedford than any rival institution. Kitchener had the complete pedigree, Old Rugbyian, Trinity and Rugby Master. At his insistence, the Rugby Code of football was played on the close from the outset. Bryan had 2 of the 3 links. He exchanged the dribbling code of football for the handling. He was remembered as running along the touchline shouting, "Go it, Arthur! Go it, Arthur!" UCS was a day school with a liberal tradition that forbade corporal punishment and impositions, but it succumbed nevertheless to rugby football. Eve was a fellow of Trinity, and he had taught under Benson at Wellington. Walker's predecessor hated football. Now it was adopted wholeheartedly. Matches were arranged against Bedford, Dulwich and some university colleges. Poole believed that all boys should and must enjoy sport. In his early days he played rugby football with the boys, occasionally in the first 15. Football at this new school, now called Plymouth College, was adapted to suit the opposition. The rugby code when playing Plymouth Football Club, and the association code for Tavistock Grammar School. Rudyard Kipling was a boy at Westward Ho at the time of this match, but it is not recorded if he or the other characters in Stalky and Co. were in the team. Probably not for Kipling. Haslam had been head boy and captain of football at Rugby and a successful housemaster at Cheltenham. He soon encouraged and developed games at Ripon. Rhodes was no games player when teaching at Haileybury and Sherborne, but he composed more than 14 songs, many praising games. When on the autumn slopes beech trees are browning, when the short summer has passed from the south, tingles our blood with the wild joys of winter, swells a glad cry from each jubilant mouth. You can sing the chorus. The 10 black arrows streamed north and south. These 10 headmasters all had strong links with rugby, and perhaps their schools took on the rugby code. Alas, I could find no records. Some, like Weymouth, closed long ago. Others, like Grantham, went into the state system. If there are any records in county archives, they are currently inaccessible due to COVID. Now for some points for discussion. The Oxford versus Cambridge divide of our 39 headmasters is fairly even. But look at the dominance of Trinity College, Cambridge, especially in the 1840s and 1850s. Do you accept my suggestion that the college played a leading role in the spread of rugby football through the schools? John Honey, in his book Tom Brown's Universe, divided the Victorian public schools into 5 leagues, based largely on which schools they played at sport. The leagues ran from 22 top schools to 81 fringe schools in the 5th Division. All the top schools that played rugby football are accounted for in our survey, bar Dulwich. Dulwich, founded in 1858, had a Trinity man as headmaster, and he was contemporary with 3 of our Trinity men, Benson, Evans and Wright. He is an honorary member of our elite. Rugby football was becoming a game for top schools. Do you agree? In only 3 cases can it be claimed that rugby's code of football was the sole ingredient that crossed from one school to another. Rugby to Cheltenham, rugby to Durham, Durham to Edinburgh. In every other case, the football code came as part of the Arnold legacy, the rugby brand. This slide lists what the governors wanted from their new headmaster. Our 39 men did not, of course, secure their appointments on the basis that they would spread the playing of rugby football. But governors and applicants knew that football came as part of the rugby package. Thus, I suggest, there was nothing special about rugby football as a game. It was special because it came from Thomas Arnold's school. Do you agree? Thomas Arnold had courted the new middle classes. He did not intend rugby to be a rival to Eton, but to seek an accommodation with it. Working in harness, like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, they would broaden the market by appealing to different tastes for similar products. Rugby in the schools of this survey were a social class below Eton, middle class rather than upper class. Take, for example, the fathers of the last 25 entries in the school registers for Eton and Rugby for the end of 1859, the middle of the 4 decades of our survey. Eton, 2 dukes, 2 lords and 1 lieutenant general. Rugby, no aristocrats and no senior military or naval officers. It follows then that if our schools were middle class, whereas Eton and its followers were upper class, so their football codes should similarly be grouped. Rugby football is the middle class code, association football is the upper class game. Do you agree? That this ranking would be inverted in the decade after 1880 is a different story, and you probably know why. Was there a Trinity Plan B, in case rugby football could not be accommodated in a common code? Did the Trinity men spread the game through personal influence, sending men out from Rugby and Trinity as headmasters of the new public schools? What do you think? And finally, if Chairman Mao's little red book could conquer China, might Rugby School's pocket-sized Laws of Rugby Football of 1845 have played a similar role in the Victorian public schools? Thank you for listening.